Hi, we're Chuck and Deb, and we've been talking about three types of networks, and today is a part 5 of what we've been talking about. And we're going to talk about living in all three types of networks.
Yeah, so the three types of networks, centralized, decentralized, and distributed, we've been talking about and defining, but we actually live in all three at the same time. And we're showing you a top-down view of all three of these networks that coexist together. And at first it might look like a mess or like distributed networks,
Yeah.
all those
Everything's
lines.
connected.
Yeah, going everywhere. And there is a distributed kind of pattern that you see here. If you notice, almost all of the nodes are connected to one another. So there's a lot of connections going on here. But if we look at the next one, Hun, what do you notice different about the view here with this one?
Yeah, if you see where the blue lines are, that's kind of showing like maybe little pockets of people, and then the green balls would be like the leadership. So in that pocket there is a leader, and so even though it looks like kind of like a crazy mess, there's actually a little bit of order to it.
Yeah. And so those green nodes would represent spiritual leaders or elders. And we kind of see networks within a network here. So we saw the distributed, then we see decentralized here, but then there's a centralized element here. And what does the gold node represent?
The gold node is the ultimate authority, who is God, like hands down. He gets all authority and everything. So, and then you notice in all of the illustrations so far, there's been one centralizing node, and it's been yellow. But as a believer, we know that ultimately the authority is God.
Yeah, and every node is connected to that gold node. And
Hopefully.
as it should be.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's kind of hard to see this top down, so let's take a side look at this. And Hun, what do you see from the side view? It's much clearer.
Yeah, this looks a little bit easier to understand maybe. Instead of all kinds of crazy lines everywhere, you can see, okay, God, the golden node is the authority, and then you can kind of see the green, that are the elders or leaders, spiritual leaders, and then, you've got everybody. And here you could see the connection to God a little bit clearer. So.
And we do want to emphasize that everyone in the network is a leader in their own way, in their own right. This is the priesthood of the believer. Now, so we have a centralized element, a distributed element, and a decentralized element of the networks all living together. And we go back to Scripture and we see these elements. And so Jesus, in his Great Commission, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It's very clear that Jesus, the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is the ultimate centralized authority.
Yeah, and who gave him all that power and authority? The Father did.
Yeah.
So.
And what's at the other end of the spectrum?
Yeah, so the other end is the, priesthood of the believers. This is a distributed part of the network. And in 1 Peter 2:9, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light."
Yeah, so you kind of have this spectrum, and we're living in the spectrum whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not. You know, sometimes we pick and choose what network we like the best, but they're like a cheese sandwich, a grilled cheese sandwich. It's grilled and it's all together. You can't pull it apart. You make a mess. So, but there is a leaning towards one direction or another when we lead in our organizations, denominations, even as far as the differences between different disciple makers. So we would say the sweet spot is in the middle, decentralized, but we're going to see some leaning one direction or the other. So, if we go too far towards the centralized as human beings, what happens?
Yeah, they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. So sometimes, like the tendency is to wield that power in a way that hurts people or is maybe self-serving. And so, it's like if you have a really, really good leader, but most leaders maybe, not anybody's perfect. So
Yeah.
there's usually some elements, and
Yeah.
it's hard to be a great
What happens
centralized.
when we go too far towards distributed as humans?
Yeah, I think we, just kind of everybody does whatever they want to do, and that can be pretty chaotic and lead to anarchy.
Yeah. So we're kind of on the scale. We're leaning one direction or another, and that's not bad as long as you don't go too far in one direction. Now, here's some real positives about leaning towards centralization. You got orthodox doctrine. You got maybe in the beginning of your ministry, in order to prevent confusion, you got a certain set of tools. If you go too far with that, then you can see here the negative, our way is the only way. So that really has to be held in tension. But for centralized communication hubs, the more you grow, the more decentralized you are or distributed, the more you have to communicate and have that centralized communication hub. And then the 4 Ps, if we try to go too centralized, then we have these artificial support systems, positional leadership, policies, procedures, and purchased influence. We'll talk about the 4 Ps more later, but that's leaning too far towards the centralized. But what are some of the benefits and negatives of leaning towards distributed?
Well, I think, with distributed, there's the good thing is you develop leaders very quickly. We called it sling them in the breach. So you can develop young leaders, a lot of them, in a short amount of time. It involves the element of trusting that people will hear from God. Are we doing a good job of helping people know how to discern God's voice? Trusting people to do the work, that we're not going to have to micromanage or hold their hand or, for maybe initially, to model it, but then eventually trust them. I think, and then the negatives, of course, are, they come up with some weird doctrine that or it just gets messy, and maybe they're maybe not making great decisions, or, having a negative impact on the people that they're leading. So
Yeah. It's interesting about heresy that usually heresy gets super centralized, and then you have entire seminaries teaching heresy. So it's not just distributed, wild-eyed, crazy people making up heresy. It's a lot of times it comes out of the centralized. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, one of the dangers that we have in being too centralized, when you look at church history, you usually do not see things unraveling because they got too distributed. Usually you see things unraveling in church history because they got too centralized. Mm-hmm. They centralized the power. They started ratcheting down on people and taking the place of God. And that's what this illustrates, is that leaders get between the people and their God, and they begin to cast a shadow. And so what's our illustration here, hon?
Yeah, so then, basically, they try to start controlling the people that they're helping. They're helping them, but they're really controlling them. And so the people are looking to them rather than looking to God or looking to Jesus. And and that's dangerous. Yeah. Whenever, you're obeying your leaders versus you're obeying God. And, we hear Jesus kind of not too excited about that happening.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the Pharisees are the classic example of this mistake. And it really kind of looks like a solar eclipse where the moon gets in the way of the sun. Now, the moon has no light of its own. It's only a reflection of the sun. That's the only light that it provides. So we as leaders need to remember that the only light that we provide comes from God, not ourselves. And if we start casting a shadow on the people that we lead, we're in a very, very dangerous position. God will move such people out of the way. Now, initially, we showed you the sideways view of the three networks working together, and those elders were kind of elevated. But what does Jesus say about these leaders, hon?
Yeah, he kind of gave us an upside down version of leadership. He who wants to be great must be the servant of all. And even in what's the reference for this?
Matthew 23.
Matthew 23, 8 through 12. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leader, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted.
All right. So we see that all three of these networks are beneficial as long as the right people are doing the right thing, and they all coexist. They all are intermingled. There's no way to avoid that. And we also saw that there's a continuum where we lean towards centralization or distributed, the pluses and minuses. But the one thing we need to remember as spiritual leaders, not to get between God and his people. Mm-hmm. So these slides are going to be, I'll put a link in the description below. And I'm also writing up a little article that has a little bit more detail in it. So if you would rather read, I'll have a link to that in the description below. So we're going to do the next video, and we're going to talk about the 4 Ps. All right. We love you. God bless you.
You could end up kind of in a situation where you have like a despot,
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
We have a
But-
catastrophe here. Yeah.